The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of the Montgomery County Courthouse, its golden light casting long, jagged shadows across the scuffed wooden floors. It was an ordinary Tuesday in 1965, and Judge William Stanton, a man known for his unwavering discipline, adjusted his black robe with the practiced precision of his 62 years. His silver hair framed a face marked by wire-rimmed glasses and a demeanor as unyielding as the courthouse itself, a red brick fortress of Southern tradition, its white columns towering like sentinels of an old order. Inside, the air hung heavy with tension. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of restless bodies, a crowd of traffic violators waiting to have their fates decided. The scent of fresh polish mingled with the musty tang of aging law books that lined the walls, their spines worn from years of scrutiny. The courtroom was alive with murmurs and nervous coughs as the clock ticked toward 9 a.m., precisely when Judge Stanton began his sessions. His punctuality was legendary, and his fines were infamous. In Montgomery, few could claim to escape his courtroom without a light or wallet. "Court is now in session!" The bailiff's booming voice shattered the buzz of anticipation. Judge Stanton entered, his chair creaking under his weight as he took his place at the bench. His cold blue eyes swept the room, a gaze that had seen countless cases. Today's docket was routine, minor traffic infractions mostly, but Stanton treated every case as an opportunity to enforce what he called proper order. For him, even a parking ticket was a chance to teach a lesson. The morning wore on in predictable fashion. A young white man received a reduced fine for running a stop sign, his sheepish grin earning a rare chuckle from the judge. An elderly white woman had her speeding ticket dismissed after explaining she was late to her grandson's baseball game. Stanton smiled briefly before moving on to the next case. But for black defendants, leniency was a foreign concept. For them, the maximum penalties were the norm, and Stanton saw no issue with this. In his eyes, the law existed to uphold the world he'd always known, one of segregated water fountains and unwritten rules that loomed as large as the courthouse itself. It was during a brief recess, as Stanton sipped his coffee in chambers, that he first saw her name, Sarah Johnson. A parking violation from the city's predominantly black district. He didn't bother reading further. Experience told him everything he needed to know. "Patterson," he called to his jittery young clerk. "How many more cases?" 15, Your Honor," Jimmy Patterson replied, shuffling papers nervously. "Mostly parking tickets." Stanton grunted, setting his coffee aside. "Good. Let's keep it moving. I've got a lunch appointment." When the recess ended, the courtroom was noticeably warmer. The ceiling fans spun lazily, doing little to ease the heat. Stanton returned to his bench, adjusting his robe and gavel as the next name was called. Sarah Johnson versus the City of Montgomery. The courtroom stilled. A few spectators shifted forward, sensing something different. Sarah Johnson rose from her seat at the defendant's table. She was a striking figure, poised and composed, her dark brown suit crisp and immaculate. A pearl necklace glimmered faintly against her skin, and her posture was straight, her expression calm. Unlike the usual defendants in Stanton's court, Sarah betrayed no hint of nervousness. Her gaze met his, unflinching, as she placed her handbag neatly on the table. Stanton cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the shift in energy. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, drawing out the Mrs. with a faint note of condescension. "You are charged with parking violation number 47,352 on Madison Avenue last Thursday. Your vehicle was parked in a restricted Zone 4. He adjusted his glasses, glancing at the report. 2 hours and 17 minutes. Do you deny this?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Most defendants would stumble over apologies or offer excuses. But Sarah's response was calm and steady. "No, Your Honor, I do not." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Stanton blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by her composed acknowledgement. He recovered quickly, his tone sharpening. "The sign clearly stated a 30-minute limit," he pressed, leaning forward slightly. "You disregarded it for over 2 hours. I trust you understand the seriousness of this violation?" "I do, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice firm yet respectful. For the first time in years, Stanton felt the faint stirrings of unease. This was not the usual dynamic of his courtroom. Sarah Johnson wasn't pleading for mercy, nor was she defiant. She was simply present, poised, and entirely unshaken. The bailiff glanced at her with curiosity, and even young Jimmy Patterson, observing from his desk, couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. "Well then," Stanton said, gripping his gavel, his voice rising with authority. "Given the blatant disregard for posted ordinances, I see no choice but to—" He paused, looking down at her file again, though his mind raced elsewhere. What was it about this woman that unsettled him? The clock ticked steadily forward, marking the moment before everything would change. Judge Stanton's gavel hovered above his desk, his knuckles white as he clutched it tightly. The heat in the courtroom was oppressive, but it wasn't just the weather. Sarah Johnson, Dr. Sarah Johnson, as he now understood, had turned the tide of the morning in a way he hadn't anticipated. The courtroom's energy was no longer under his control. He glanced at the folded paper in his hand again, its weight far heavier than the sheet of paper itself. The fine, $2.50, had already elicited subtle gasps from the crowd earlier. It was an egregiously high penalty, even by his own strict standards. Jimmy Patterson had paused mid-note, his pencil hovering as he realized the disparity between this case and others. But Sarah had not flinched. Her calm acceptance of the number had, in a quiet yet pointed way, thrown a glaring spotlight on its unfairness. And now, standing with perfect composure, she had exposed something far more damning than a traffic fine. "Dr. Johnson," Stanton said finally, his voice a faint echo of its earlier authority. The honorific tasted foreign on his tongue, but ignoring it now was impossible. "Your explanation is noted. However, the court must remain focused on the matter of the fine." "Of course, Your Honor," Sarah replied with a gracious nod, her tone smooth as glass. "I merely wish to provide context for my actions, as is my right." Her words were razor-sharp in their simplicity. For a moment, Stanton felt the weight of the courtroom pressing in around him, the spectators, the court reporter scribbling furiously in the corner, and Jimmy Patterson, who was practically frozen in place. Sarah stepped forward, her shoes clicking softly on the floor. The noise echoed like gunshots in the silence. "Your Honor," she began, opening a small notebook she had retrieved from her handbag. "Parking violations are, of course, matters of law. However, when those regulations disproportionately hinder citizens from exercising their constitutional rights, the issue becomes more significant." The courtroom buzzed faintly as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Stanton's mouth tightened. "Are you implying," he began, his voice rising defensively, "that this court is—" "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor," Sarah interrupted gently but firmly, her voice cutting through his like a blade. "I am presenting facts. Facts that I intend to include in my report to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division." At that, the murmurs in the gallery became an audible ripple of reactions. A few of the black spectators sat straighter, pride gleaming in their eyes, while others exchanged quiet, knowing glances. Several white observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Stanton, his face reddening, tugged at his collar as if it were suddenly suffocating him. Sarah's calm demeanor remained unchanged. "I have here signed statements," she continued, holding up a small stack of neatly bound documents, "from over 30 individuals who have faced similar challenges when attempting to register to vote in this city. Many of them are veterans, grandmothers, and lifelong residents of Montgomery. These are people who have served this country and this community, yet they face barriers at every turn." She took another step forward, and the room fell silent again. "And I should point out," she added with a measured tone, "that courts in Birmingham and Jackson have already ruled similar parking restrictions unconstitutional. The federal government took notice of those cases. I'm confident they'll be equally interested in Montgomery." Stanton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his grip tightening on the gavel. The sweat on his brow glistened in the beam of sunlight now falling directly across his bench. Sarah's words hung heavy in the room, their implications impossible to ignore. The authority he wielded so effortlessly just an hour ago now felt precariously perched, like a teetering balance on the edge of collapse. "Dr. Johnson," Stanton said again, his voice quieter now, "the law must be upheld." "I agree," Sarah replied smoothly. "And I believe that's precisely what we're discussing here, Your Honor, the fair and equal application of the law." Her gaze locked with his, unwavering, and Stanton felt a crack form in the facade he had spent decades building. He looked to Jimmy Patterson, who was still standing at the edge of the bench, his expression equal parts astonishment and curiosity. Then his eyes flicked toward the court reporter, who didn't so much as glance up from her furious scribbling. Finally, Stanton cleared his throat and spoke, his voice faltering slightly. "In light of your unique circumstances, Dr. Johnson," he began, stumbling over the words, "this court will reconsider the fine." His gavel trembled as he brought it down with less force than usual. "The amount is reduced to $25. Gasps echoed throughout the room. Black spectators exchanged smiles, their faces alight with quiet triumph, while others nodded solemnly, acknowledging the significance of what had just occurred. Sarah, however, gave no outward reaction. She inclined her head slightly, her composure unbroken. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said simply. The tension in the room began to dissipate, but the energy remained electric. Everyone present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, a shift, however small, in the rigid structures of power and prejudice. Sarah gathered her papers, slipping them neatly into her handbag, and turned to leave the courtroom. She walked with the same quiet dignity with which she had entered, the beam of sunlight now trailing her like a spotlight. As the door closed behind her, Stanton sat motionless at his bench. The courtroom murmured softly, and Jimmy Patterson finally picked up his pencil again, though his hand trembled slightly as he resumed his notes. For the first time in decades, Judge William Stanton felt the weight of his own gavel, and the realization that his courtroom, like the world outside it, was beginning to change. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Judge Stanton fumbled with the note in his hands. His clerk, Jimmy Patterson, had begun frantically flipping through papers, newspaper clippings and legal documents that confirmed Dr. Sarah Johnson's identity without a shadow of a doubt. The revelations were startling. Dr. Johnson was no ordinary citizen. She was a renowned civil rights leader whose name was known far beyond Montgomery. The clippings revealed photographs of her at major rallies with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., standing triumphantly on the steps of the Supreme Court after winning a landmark housing case, and even appearing in newspapers for her key role in drafting sections of the Civil Rights Act. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. One elderly man leaned toward his neighbor, whispering, "That's the same Dr. Johnson who desegregated the bus stations in Atlanta." Another voice echoed from the back. "My cousin's children got into university because of her lawsuit." Judge Stanton's face had shifted from red to pale, as Jimmy continued to pass him more documents, each revealing another facet of Dr. Johnson's extraordinary career. She had argued cases before the Supreme Court, challenged discriminatory voting practices, and even secured a spot on a presidential commission for equal rights. Stanton's nervousness intensified as he absorbed the depth of her legal expertise, a stark contrast to his own career. "Your Honor," Jimmy Patterson stammered, "Dr. Johnson is scheduled to testify before Congress next week about discriminatory practices in Southern courts." The gavel, which had been tightly gripped in Stanton's hand, slipped free and crashed onto the desk. The sound reverberated through the courtroom, startling several spectators. Some tried to suppress their smiles as they watched the once imposing figure of Judge Stanton struggle to maintain control. Dr. Johnson, on the other hand, stood with remarkable calm, her posture unyielding and composed, her only movement the slight adjustment of her glasses. She glanced at her watch, her demeanor unshaken as if this were just another day in court. Breaking the stillness, Dr. Johnson spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a practiced professional. "I believe we were discussing the constitutionality of certain parking regulations, Your Honor." The courthouse reporter, no longer attempting to remain unnoticed, now scribbled frantically, aware that the story unfolding before them was of national importance. Several attorneys who had been waiting for their own cases to be called had moved closer, their curiosity piqued. They had come to study legal procedures, but now they found themselves witnessing a master class in civil rights advocacy. Judge Stanton cleared his throat several times, trying to regain his composure. "Yes, well, Dr. Johnson," he began, hesitating, his voice strained. "It seems there might be some broader considerations regarding these parking ordinances that warrant further review." Jimmy Patterson, still sifting through papers, gasped again. "Your Honor," he said, now with more steadiness in his voice, "Dr. Johnson recently won the case against discriminatory parking enforcement in Birmingham last month. The federal court cited her argument in their ruling." Judge Stanton turned pale, his expression one of discomfort rather than anger. He recognized the case. It was one he had dismissed as federal overreach just the week before. Now, standing before him, was the very attorney who had won that case. He was on the wrong side of history. Dr. Johnson, ever composed, remained standing as she watched him process the information, her briefcase open before her, filled with neatly stacked papers. It was clear that she had come prepared, not just for a simple traffic case, but for a much larger fight. "I believe," she said, her voice steady, "that the Birmingham case might be particularly relevant to our discussion today, Your Honor." The heat in the courtroom had become stifling, yet no one moved. They all sensed the significance of the moment unfolding. Judge Stanton loosened his collar, his discomfort palpable. The papers before him now felt like a weight he could no longer ignore. The $250 fine, once so certain in its imposition, now seemed absurd in light of the new information. Judge Stanton finally spoke, his voice unsteady. "Dr. Johnson, your reputation precedes you. Your work in civil rights law is impressive." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the gallery. Judge Stanton, known for his harsh and prejudiced rulings, had never before acknowledged the achievements of someone like Dr. Johnson, especially not publicly. "Thank you, Your Honor," Dr. Johnson replied, her tone gracious but firm. "But today, I'm simply a citizen concerned about the equal application of law, just like everyone else in this courtroom." Her words echoed in the room, and for the first time, Judge Stanton truly saw the division in his own courtroom. The racial tensions that had always been there, unspoken, were now laid bare. He felt the weight of his role in perpetuating that inequality, and for the first time, he felt uncomfortable in his own skin. As the room fell silent, Jimmy Patterson approached the bench again, this time with a Harvard Law Review journal in hand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steadier than before, "Dr. Johnson's article on discriminatory enforcement of municipal codes was published last month." Judge Stanton glanced at the journal, his face flushed with embarrassment. The journal was one he had never managed to contribute to in his long career, but there it was, an article by Dr. Johnson, whose expertise had already shaped the nation's legal landscape. "Perhaps," Dr. Johnson suggested, her voice calm, "we might review the pattern of parking enforcement around voter registration offices. I have some rather interesting statistics about the disparity in fines between different neighborhoods in Montgomery." Judge Stanton stared at the fine in front of him, now a glaring symbol of the bias Dr. Johnson had spent her career fighting. The realization that he had tried to enforce discriminatory practices on someone of her caliber weighed heavily on him. The courtroom, once his domain of authority, had become the stage for his own reckoning. The clock ticked on, marking the passing moments. Judge Stanton knew his next words would either cement his role in the old, dying era of Southern injustice or acknowledge the profound shift that had already begun. Clearing his throat, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. "I believe a revision of the fine is in order." He hesitated, his fingers trembling on the desk. "The court hereby reduces the fine to a warning." The words hung in the air, a stunning reversal. A collective murmur spread through the courtroom. Dr. Johnson's calm and methodical advocacy had not only earned her a reduced fine but had also exposed the systemic inequities that ran deep in Montgomery's legal system. Judge Stanton, trying to salvage some semblance of authority, added, "I believe it would be appropriate to review the parking regulations around civic buildings, particularly those that provide essential services to citizens. Dr. Johnson nodded slightly, her eyes glimmering with quiet victory. Of course, Your Honor, she said. Perhaps this could be the beginning of a broader review of similar ordinances throughout the county. Stanton's face flushed again, but he had no choice but to agree. Yes, well, that would seem appropriate. The clerk, Jimmy Patterson, was already making notes. For him, the significance of the moment was clear. This was a turning point. The courtroom, once a place where injustice was upheld with authority, had now become the stage for its reckoning. Dr. Johnson's eyes sparkled as she stood, poised and dignified. She had not only avoided a fine, she had pushed the court to confront its own prejudices, to begin a process of change that would extend far beyond this small Montgomery courthouse. As she left the courtroom, the weight of history hung in the air. The courthouse reporter scribbled furiously, knowing this was a moment that would echo far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The systemic changes Dr. Johnson had set in motion were just beginning. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Stanton fumbled with the note in his hand. His clerk, Jimmy Patterson, anxiously searched through more papers, pulling out newspaper clippings and legal documents that confirmed Dr. Sarah Johnson's identity beyond any doubt. Dr. Johnson's name had long been known beyond Montgomery. Her achievements and civil rights work were well documented. Newspaper photographs showed her beside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at rallies, on the steps of the Supreme Court with a briefcase after winning a landmark case, and more. Whispers spread through the room, a growing realization that this was no ordinary defendant. Judge Stanton's face turned pale as Patterson handed him more files. Your Honor, Patterson said, Dr. Johnson is scheduled to testify before Congress next week about discriminatory practices in Southern courts. The judge's gavel slipped from his hands and clattered loudly on the desk. The room jumped at the noise, while some spectators couldn't help but smile at the spectacle of the usually composed judge struggling. Dr. Johnson, however, remained calm and poised, adjusting her glasses and glancing at her watch. I believe, she said softly, cutting through the tension, we were discussing the constitutionality of certain parking regulations, Your Honor. There was no mockery in her tone, only professionalism. The courtroom reporter, who had been casually observing, quickly began scribbling furiously, aware that what was happening would soon make headlines. Several lawyers watching the proceedings abandoned their own cases, drawn into the drama unfolding before them. Judge Stanton, visibly rattled, cleared his throat several times. Dr. Johnson, he began, his voice now subdued. It seems there may be broader considerations regarding these parking ordinances that warrant further review. Meanwhile, Patterson continued to dig through the papers, occasionally gasping in disbelief as he uncovered more details about Dr. Johnson's career. Your Honor, he said louder now, Dr. Johnson wrote the famous brief on equal protection under the law, which is taught in law schools. The judge shot Patterson a sharp glance but couldn't undo the damage done by the revelation. The irony of a renowned civil rights lawyer being harassed over a parking ticket was not lost on the courtroom. Two young black law students, sitting in the back, had come to observe legal procedures but found themselves witnessing a lesson in civil rights advocacy. An elderly white woman in the gallery, who had only received a warning for the same violation earlier, stood up and left, her face flushed with embarrassment. The sunlight through the courthouse windows shifted, casting light onto the state seal behind the judge's bench. The motto, "We dare defend our rights," now seemed to carry new meaning. Dr. Johnson opened her briefcase again and gently placed another document on the table. Your Honor, if it would assist the court, I have prepared a brief analysis of similar parking regulations that have been challenged in other jurisdictions, she offered. Judge Stanton stared at the document as though it might bite. He hesitated before reaching out to take it. The mere act of accepting a document from a black attorney in 1965 Montgomery was itself a small revolution. The court will review this information, he muttered, placing it on his desk. His voice had lost the authority it once commanded, sounding old and weary. He raised his gavel, eager to conclude the session, but Dr. Johnson wasn't finished. She opened her briefcase one last time. Your Honor, I've taken the liberty of preparing a preliminary report on parking enforcement disparities in Montgomery County, she said. The judge stared at her with an unreadable expression, and the room watched in silence. After a long pause, he accepted the document. As the gavel fell, marking the end of the case, it felt as though more had ended than just the proceedings. It was as if a quiet revolution had taken place within the courtroom. Outside, Dr. Johnson walked down the courthouse steps with quiet dignity, her heels tapping softly against the marble. The sun reflected off her pearl necklace, but it was the serene smile on her face that truly shone. A small group of young civil rights activists had gathered at the base of the stairs, eager to speak with her. James Turner, a 23-year-old law student, approached her with wide eyes. "That was masterful, Dr. Johnson," he said, clutching his notebook. "You never raised your voice, never showed anger, yet you changed everything." An elderly woman, Mary Wilson, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "I've been coming to this courthouse for 40 years, she said softly, her voice trembling. "I never thought I'd see the day when one of us would make that judge stammer and sweat like that." Dr. Johnson smiled warmly, her calm demeanor radiating wisdom. "The law," she said, "is like water. It wears down the hardest stone, not through force, but through persistence and precision." As the crowd nodded, understanding the deep implications of her words, they also knew they had witnessed more than a legal victory. They had seen a demonstration of grace, dignity, and the quiet power of justice. Through the courthouse windows, they could see Judge Stanton still sitting at his desk, staring at the report Dr. Johnson had left. His next cases had been delayed as he pondered the weight of what had just transpired. Jimmy Patterson, the young clerk, was already working energetically, making copies of the report. A young reporter from the local black newspaper approached Dr. Johnson with a question. "Will you be following up on the judge's promise to review all parking regulations?" he asked, pencil poised. "Oh yes," she replied, her smile gentle but resolute. "This is just the beginning. Sometimes it takes a small crack to bring down a wall." As she opened her briefcase, revealing more reports from other counties, she added, "Change doesn't always come from big, dramatic moments. Sometimes it comes from parking tickets and patience." The crowd, inspired, began to disperse, many of them already taking notes. Then, unexpectedly, Jimmy Patterson appeared again, rushing down the steps. "Dr. Johnson," he called out, breathless. "Judge Stanton has just ordered a complete review of all parking violations from the past year. He's asking if you might consult on the review process." A knowing smile passed between Dr. Johnson and her supporters. The very judge who had tried to intimidate her earlier was now seeking her expertise. "Please tell Judge Stanton," Dr. Johnson replied, her voice carrying so that everyone could hear, "that I would be happy to assist the court in ensuring equal justice under the law." Her words, simple yet powerful, carried the weight of history. As she walked toward her car, the afternoon sun cast her shadow long across the courthouse steps. That shadow seemed to stretch all the way to Judge Stanton's window, where he sat deep in thought, perhaps understanding at last that his world was changing, one small case at a time. James Turner, the young law student, watched her walk away with wonder in his eyes. "She didn't just win a case today," he said, awe in his voice. "She taught us all how to win with grace." And so, on that warm Alabama afternoon, a simple parking ticket became a lesson in courage, dignity, and the quiet power of justice. The courthouse would never be quite the same again, and neither would those who witnessed Dr. Sarah Johnson's quiet revolution.